What's going on, guys? It's Ty the TV Guy here, and I want to discuss today the 5 most heartbreaking scenes / moments in the history of Breaking Bad. Now, this will only include the actual Breaking Bad show, nothing from Better Call Saul that's still within the Breaking Bad universe, so we're only focusing on Breaking Bad seasons 1 through 5 here. For my top 5, I tried to factor in the moments that physically made me cry or the most sad in the show, and then also what is objectively just really awful things that happen. But I could only pick 5 things in a show where there's so much tragedy, so much loss. So I'm definitely gonna have some honorable mentions to get into right before I get into the list. But before I do that, if you enjoy Breaking Bad and other content on TV shows, like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. All right, so to quickly skim over the honorable mentions, I have Jane dies and Jesse cries, meaning when Jane dies, obviously just Walt, kind of letting her die and watching her die and making that, instinctive decision in the moment because he thought it would be better for Jesse. That is just tragic that, she relapsed and then he could have saved her and he didn't. And then the scene where Walt goes to rescue Jesse from that crazy house he's in, and Jesse's crying and saying how much he loved her. So that whole situation with Jane is just tragic. I also have Jesse killing Gale. I think it's tragic that, Gale, a fairly innocent person, once again, everyone in this isn't fully innocent because they're involved in illicit activities, cooking meth. But Gale certainly was a nerd that just got into it because he probably found it interesting, not because he wanted to harm people or he has an awful heart. So him dying in itself, with cold-blooded murder is pretty tragic. And then obviously it took quite a mental toll on Jesse as well. And you could tell even in the moment he didn't want to do it, but he felt like he had to. And he was pretty messed up after that, just like a lot of times in the show when he has to do something awful. Of course, I have Todd killing the random kid in season 5 on the bike just to try to, save their butts from getting caught, I guess. Of course, Jesse disagreed and was very bothered by Todd's actions and kind of saw him as a complete monster and creep after that, as he should have. Todd was obviously awful. This just didn't make my top 5 because, to me, I had more of a connection with a lot of the things that happened in the top 5, but this is certainly, from a broad point of view, potentially the most tragic thing that happens in the show. I just have more of the main character moments in my top 5. And then the last honorable mentions that came to my mind were a couple things with Mike. First of all, of course, his death scene was just pretty sad to see one of the favorite characters in the show go. And then him saying goodbye to his granddaughter. Obviously, it seemed like everything he was doing was for her. And unfortunately, a lot of his efforts seemed to be for naught because whoever is in charge of doing it confiscated the money that was supposed to go to her anyway. So seeing him, look at her for the last time in the park, knowing it's going to be the last time he ever sees her, was pretty heartbreaking as well. All right, so after a couple minutes of honorable mention talk, we're finally ready to get into the top 5. And I just wanted to mention, I noticed when making this list that all 5 of my top 5 actually occur in the 5th and final season of Breaking Bad. And I think that makes sense because obviously I think this show just gets more and more serious and tragic and devastating as you go along. I think if you notice, there's a lot more humor and comedy, especially with the Jesse and Walt banter in the first couple seasons. But yeah, at number 5, I have Andrea being murdered in front of Jesse at the hands of cold-blooded Todd, of course. And to me, this had to crack my top 5 because it was one of a series of things that Jesse was going through at this point in the show. And it just felt like at this point, the writers had it in for Jesse or something. I mean, his whole life, at least that we've seen on screen, has just been one tragedy after another. I mean, you're thinking back throughout the show, all the times where he narrowly escaped death, all the times where he lost someone he cared about, where he was hospitalized because of the whole Hank thing. And it really stems from getting involved with Walt and Walt manipulating him oftentimes. Now, obviously, he continues to do this under his own volition at some points, but it does feel like Jesse does get the short end of the stick so often. And this is way beyond just getting the short end of the stick. I mean, this is an awful thing to witness. And I don't want to go too far into this one because I have kind of a related topic later on in this list. But yeah, I mean, obviously Andrea, looking at it from her perspective, just a pretty innocent person raising her son to the best of her ability. And he's already been poisoned the prior season by Walt, which could have been one of the most heartbreaking things too. There's too much to even go through in the show. But her being an innocent person, getting killed, Brock now having no mother, and Jesse caring so much for Brock, and as he's shown throughout the entire show, he just has such a soft spot for kids. It just makes it coming to this moment in one of the final episodes just so devastating. All right, so at number 4, I have a moment that actually, upon my recent rewatch with my girlfriend, actually made me cry the most. I mean, all the other parts I might have gotten like a little teary-eyed or something. This part I was uncontrollable. But I put it at 4 and not at 1 because I don't think it had like the stakes of the other moments I have above this. But for me personally, it did make me cry the most. And it's Walt watching Walter Jr. through the window from afar in the final episode of the show before he goes to save Jesse at Todd's family's complex. And this is kind of like a more niche moment. I don't even know if you haven't seen the show in a while, you might not specifically remember what I'm talking about. But in the final episode, when Walt returns back to Albuquerque to handle his business, to kill off Todd's family and Lydia and all that, Todd stops by, obviously, to have that conversation with Skylar. He sees his baby daughter, and then he kind of like walks across the street, gazes through a window, and sees Walt Jr. coming back home from school. And it's so sad to me because, he can't even speak to his son. He can't even go approach his son and say, "Pie," or I guess bye in this scenario would be more fitting. Like, he can't even get that closure with his son because he's dug himself a hole so deep that his family wants nothing to do with him. Nobody wants anything to do with him. He really, through what he thought was important, gaining money for his family, he really did the opposite of what they wanted all along. They just wanted him for who he was. They didn't want his money, especially not his drug money. They didn't want him to be some powerful figure. They just wanted him to be the same Walt that he always was. And unfortunately, his decisions and springing into this industry and how power hungry he became, it cost him his family, eventually cost him his life, it cost him everything he once cared about, and he didn't even really obviously reap the benefits of everything he sacrificed in the end because, he lost all his money, he lost his family, and, everything that was originally important to him and everything that, at least he could have gained a lot of money, but he lost all that too. So it literally all ended up being pointless. And it all, to me, built up partially to that moment to where here's my son walking in the front door of his house across the street, and I can't even go hug him. I can't even go say bye. I just have to stand here teary-eyed from afar. To me, that was devastating. I can't imagine a scenario like that with like a father and son in real life. It would just be so heartbreaking. So I have it at number 4. It was really moving, a really emotional and moving scene for me personally. Could have been higher, but the fact that I feel like some fans might not even remember this moment if they haven't watched it in a really long time or just don't have the best memory with shows and stuff, which is okay. I felt like I had to put it down at 4 instead. At number 3, I have a generic title of Walt Loses His Family. But specifically what I'm thinking of when talking about this heartbreaking moment is in Season 6, Episode 14, when, Ozymandias, I believe it's pronounced, when Walt comes back home after Hank dies and, he's kind of freed by Todd's family a little bit, and he tries to, corral Walt Jr. and Skylar and tells them, we got to leave right now. We got to pack our things and leave. And, they start questioning him. They're not going to go along with it anymore. And eventually Skylar comes to the conclusion that Walt killed Hank. He frantically tries to defend himself because even though he technically didn't kill Hank, and he's technically correct, obviously he still played an instrumental part in the downfall of Hank. So even though him and Skylar kind of had an on and off relationship as the show went on, even though as of recent she had been taking his side again more, and things were iffy with his kids because Hank and Marie were trying to get them. And, he just hadn't been seeing them as much, and being honest with, Walt Jr. especially, he still technically had them until this point. He still had the trust of his son. He still had his baby girl in the house, and he still had Skylar kind of on his side despite everything. But this moment in this episode is when he truly lost them and they turned on him, and rightfully so. I'm not saying they turned on him like as a bad thing. He deserved to be turned on. But Skylar grabs the knife as Walt goes back to the bedroom. She pulls a knife on him. She cuts his hand. She, tries to get him off her, and then Walt Jr. pulls his dad off her as well. And I think it's a pretty powerful image when The camera kind of pans away from the whole situation as Skylar and Walt Jr. are wrestling Walt on the ground. And then, Walt kind of backs off and says, like, what is this? We're supposed to be a family. And then you see Skylar and Walt Jr. just, sitting there like shivering and quivering in fear. To me, that really shows how much of a monster that Walt has grown into, that even his family views him that way. They are truly frightened of what he's become and what he's capable of. So it's yet another tragic family moment where all the decisions we've seen him make throughout the show, all the change we've seen him go through, the power-hungry, just kind of insane, egotistical person we've seen him grow into, it's all led to this. Your family shivering in the corner, wrestling you off of them and calling the cops on you because they think you're a dangerous monster. To me, doesn't get much more heartbreaking and devastating than that. So I have that at number 3. So at number 2 here, I have Jesse being tortured. And obviously this slightly goes hand in hand with number 5 of Andrea being killed in front of him, because that was a method of Todd and his family to torture Jesse and, kind of make a statement to him that, you try to escape again, we'll kill someone else you care about, or maybe we'll just kill you. But yeah, that's definitely one of the forms of torture. But really just over like the last 3 episodes in general, when they basically have him as a meth cook slave, they keep him in a cage underground, and they only really bring him up to see the daylight for a few seconds, and then they stick him in the meth lab and have him work for them, obviously for nothing, to barely get scraps of food to just survive. Obviously he's in pretty bad health condition and mental condition, of course, and it's just really hard to see a character in the show with probably the purest soul. Even though he gets himself into bad things, I do think he has a pure soul and a pretty good heart. And I think outside of this, just who he is on the inside, he's a decent person. Seeing him be tortured like this, become a slave for undoubtedly the most unlikable characters in the show, and some of the most unlikable characters I've ever watched. They're just disgusting people. Seeing him at their mercy and seeing how desperate he is, it's just really sad, and something that Jesse doesn't deserve. Walt, the things that happened to him, you're like, okay, he kind of brought this on himself. But Jesse, in a way, did. He was a little meth slinger before he met Walt, but it really feels like this got to a level that it never would have come close to if he never had to go 10 toes in with Walt and be manipulated the way he was. So definitely feel for Jesse in this show, and glad about the outcomes later on for him, that he ultimately gets to escape. But that span of 2 to 3 episodes where he's being locked up, enslaved, and tortured, it's really hard to watch for me. And at number 1, what I think is probably the pinnacle of Breaking Bad, the series defining moment perhaps, is when Hank dies. I think it's the most heartbreaking moment in the show altogether. You see, of course, just for Hank and Marie, they just get off the phone and he says, I got him, baby. I locked Walt up. We got to him. He's not going to be a threat to anyone anymore. And he got his job done. Marie said, I can't, and they couldn't wait to see each other later. And then, unfortunately, Todd's insane, awful family pulls up and just mows him and Steve down. So it's awful, obviously, just in terms of the cold-blooded murder that takes place of a pretty commendable person in Hank, trying to do the right thing. Even though he's flawed just like everyone else, he's generally one of the best characters in this show, morality-wise, and, trying to do the right thing. Obviously, he's a DEA agent, so in general, that's kind of the nature of who he is. So it's awful to watch just on surface level because of Hank losing his life and being murdered unrightfully. And, we know how that's going to affect Marie, of course. And then it's devastating to watch from Walt's perspective, too. The one thing that Walt emphasized, even as he grew more power hungry and seemingly more willing to take any measure to protect himself down the line, the one thing he always said is that, we never kill family, we never touch family, that's not an option. A couple times when, Saul, trying to save himself, floated the idea of taking out Hank or something like that, Walt said, he's family, he's off limits, there better be another plan. And the whole time, Walt always said he was doing it for his family, and then, trying to protect himself and all of them, and then it finally leading to a moment where you can't protect your family anymore. What you've done has led to this awful outcome of someone who is one of very few family members for you, gets their life taken right in front of your eyes, and you can't do anything about it because you've dug the hole so deep, and unfortunately it's the fate that you brought upon him. So it's just heartbreaking all around. Not saying that I feel bad for Walt, it's like the opposite, but it still just gives you a very uneasy feeling inside. And then of course it's heartbreaking from the standpoint of Hank and Marie, and Skyler, Walt Jr., who all care about him. So I think this, like I said, is like the pinnacle of the show. Ozymandias, I hope I'm saying that episode title right. That episode is like the highest rated episode of any TV show ever. And, this happens right at the beginning of the episode. And then, chaos ensues for the remainder of the show. And Walt and, the whole storyline just kind of goes in a downward spiral because, Hank dying is what kind of set the madness into motion. Even more so than him discovering out, what happened to Walt. Obviously a peaceful conclusion out of that would have been just him arresting him, sending him off to prison, and Walt gets what he deserves for all the awful crimes he's committed and, people he's negatively affected and killed. That's it. That's the list. That's my top 5 with some honorable mentions. I'm sure I left some things off that have made you guys emotional watching this show. So let me know in the comments if you think I missed anything or if something, strikes a chord with you a little more on a personal level. And otherwise, thank you guys for watching. This is Ty the TV Guy signing off till next time. Peace.